Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Representative Houlihan's Telephone Town Hall. If at any point this evening you have a question and would like to ask the Congresswoman a question, please press *3 on your phone. At that point, you'll be transferred to a member of our staff who will take down your question and enter you into the queue. Of course, we're going to do our best to get to all the questions this evening, but if we don't get to a question, we promise to give you a call back with an answer within the next 48 hours. So at any point, again, if you have a question, please press *3. Also, if you have a pen and paper available, it'd be great to keep out. The Congresswoman will be going through a number of details and contact info as well. So with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Representative Houlihan.
Thanks, Connor, and I'm very grateful to be here with you guys tonight. This is actually the first town hall that we've done in quite a long time that hasn't been exclusively focused on COVID-19 or the pandemic. So I'm grateful to have the chance to give you an update on a couple of other things while we're joined together today. I will start, however, by giving you some legislative updates before we begin the process of answering your questions. Specific to COVID-19, it does definitely deserve some time to talk about what we've done in Congress that relates to COVID-19 and the pandemic. Over the past several months, I have helped pass 4 bipartisan stimulus packages that the President has signed. So these are packages that have either started in the House or started in the Senate. They've come together and they've been pushed forward to the President for his signature. Among other things, these bills have established something that I think is fairly remarkable, which was called the Paycheck Protection Program. We also have established through this legislation increased access to testing, federally funded vaccine development research, and we have, of course, been supportive of our first responders and healthcare workers, and much, much more in these 4 bipartisan bills. In addition to that, I've been working to establish a National Public Health Corps through my bipartisan National Public Health Corps Act of 2020. This bipartisan bill would create a new branch of national service, the National Public Health Corps, within the Corporation for National and Community Service, or CNCS, to mobilize service-minded individuals to join the COVID-19 response and to support the enduring public health needs in our communities across the country. This Corps would help fill the personnel gap in our current healthcare sector to ramp up testing, contact tracing, and eventually the distribution of a hopeful vaccine. Definitely as a person who has been of service throughout my life, whether in the military or through the AmeriCorps organization as a teacher, I recognize the importance of national service, and it's particularly acute right now at this time of pandemic. And a little bit of other update in terms of the COVID-19 response with small business. I did help to pass the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which is typically called the CARES Act. It is also a historic bipartisan stimulus package that includes a mandate to make federally backed low-interest loans and grants available to our country's smallest businesses. I've been meeting virtually with our community's small business owners and lending institutions to hear all of our concerns and to translate that into feedback into subsequent and future legislative actions that address our small businesses in this time of need. I did also mount an effort to urge the House and the Senate leadership to pay special attention to the very, very unique challenges that face micro businesses or very, very small businesses and sole proprietorships as they are trying to also weather this crisis. I've successfully led efforts to make sure that EIDL, or the emergency disaster loans that are available to many, will be available to our agricultural producers as well. For many of you, you know that Chester and Berks County have remarkable resources, and many of them are in the agricultural industry. And early days during this crisis, the agricultural industry and agricultural businesses weren't able to access many of the helps, either through the EIDL program or the Paycheck Protection Program that were available to other small businesses. I also helped to pass the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act really recently, and this the President also signed into law. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation which amends certain loan forgiveness rules from the PPP and defers payroll taxes for PPP borrowers. The Ppp Flexibility Act increases the current limitation on non-payroll taxes, things such as rent or mortgage or interest, for loan forgiveness from 25% to 40%. So originally, the Paycheck Protection Program required that 75% of the loan was used for paychecks for employees. This Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act allowed a little bit more flexibility to expand the use of that loan or hopefully that grant from 25 to 40%. It also removed the retroactivity on the increase of loan maturity from 2 to 5 years. So originally the loan was going to be called in 2 years, and now the loan will be called in 5 years. And remember, many of these loans actually will be forgiven in the form of a grant for many of our small businesses who are taking advantage of this program. I'm very glad to see that the SBA, the Small Business Administration, has really acted very quickly in implementing these changes to the PPP. I'm also leading an effort to urge the SBA and Treasury to make demographic information public for SBC oversight. So what is important here is we really need to understand where the billions and billions of dollars of taxes that we are putting forward into the Paycheck Protection Program are going. We need to specifically make sure we understand who's getting the loans, what they're using them for, and also whether women and minority-owned businesses or businesses that are owned by sole proprietorships or are very small businesses are indeed accessing or able to access PPP and EIDL loans as the program was designed or intended for. So that's a little bit of the legislative update in terms of our COVID response. And here's a bit of an update in terms of our office's response. Similar to today, we've held 10 virtual town halls since the start of this pandemic. This is the very first time that we haven't invited experts to join us in quite some time, but our town halls have been really focused on facts and information and making sure to deliver them from experts in their fields. So we've featured experts from Penn Medicine, the Small Business Administration, from our local hospitals and mental health facilities, and much, much more. We've also established 3 rapid response teams within our organization to make sure that we can serve our community better during this time of crisis. We've specifically established the Small Business Rapid Response Group. And again, if you have that pen or paper available and you're interested in getting help on your small business or you have questions on that, you can reach out to our rapid response team at PA06, which is like the Pennsylvania 06 or the 6th district, .smallbusiness@mail.house.gov. And I'll give that to you one more time and then at the end as well. PA06.smallbusiness@mail.house.gov. We also stood up a similar team for taxes and rebates. Of course, many questions on taxes and rebates. The rapid response email information for that would be pa06.taxesandrebates@mail.house.gov. Again, that email, pa06.taxesandrebates@mail.house.gov. And finally, we established a rapid response team for unemployment, pa06.unemploymentcompensation@mail.house.gov. Largely, unemployment issues are those of the state. Obviously, our legislation pushed forward resources to all of our states. But if you do have any issues with unemployment compensation, with taxes and rebates, or with small businesses, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to our rapid response teams. We have definitely pivoted very rapidly a lot of the resources that we had in our Congress prior to COVID to be focused on these most acute needs of our communities. I've also been hosting and participating in a lot of roundtables and community hearings with local and national leaders, including with Dr. Fauci, with our Pennsylvania Agricultural Secretary, Russell Redding, with our Small Business Administrator, Jovita Carranza, and with Governor Wolf. And lastly, of course, with the Secretary of Health, Dr. Rachel Levine, and many more, to make sure that I, as your representative, have our fingers on the pulse of what's going on, both at a state and a national level. The next thing that will probably be at the top of your mind is what is going on in Congress in terms of justice and policing. And so I'd like to spend a little time going over what is happening here. I'm actually sitting here speaking to you from Washington right now. This week, the House of Representatives will vote on the Justice in Policing Act, of which I am a co-sponsor. In the Justice in Policing Act, there are a variety of different provisions, and some of them are as follows. This provision, this act, would stop no-knock warrants in the case of drug cases. It would end qualified immunity, which is a doctrine that is a barrier to holding police officers accountable for wrongful conduct. It would combat racial profiling. It would mandate data collection, including body cameras and dashboard cameras. And it would establish new standards for policing. And much of this would be tied to federal funding as well. So the ask is that local and state police organizations would be responsible for these various ideals. And if they are responsible to those, then the federal funding that accompanies those would flow as well. There are moments when we are called upon to be leaders. We are called upon to stand up for what is right in our community, for our Commonwealth, and for our country. And I very much feel like this vote, this moment in the Justice and Policing Act, for me, is one of those moments. It is definitely an undeniable fact that systemic racism exists in our country, and that it has since our very founding. We have certainly borne witness over these past few weeks to this systemic racism, which has been prevalent for a very long time. And it is a unified call that I'm responding to act right now, to address the police brutality and to address the disparate treatment of people of color, particularly Black Americans. I know in my heart that by co-sponsoring the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, that this is the right thing to do and to begin answering that call. And I will continue to meet with and learn from members of our community, Black leaders, law enforcement leaders, advocates, activists, and experts to make sure I hear all of our concerns and to make sure that we're addressing them and bringing them to Washington and to Congress. So as we move forward on our conversation about justice and equity, I am very committed to making sure that I'm looking at areas where the systemic racism is present in our country and hoping to work to dismantle it through our effective community-driven legislation that is such as the Justice and Policing Act. Last little bit of information from Washington. I've been very busy in Washington continuing the work of the people, which is separate from what's going on, of course, through the pandemic, through COVID, and separate from what's going on with the Justice and Policing Act. Currently, I'm here in Washington working as part of my 3 committees that I serve on the Armed Services Committee. The Armed Services Committee every year is tasked with the NDAA, the National Defense Act. And I'm working here as the only member in Pennsylvania who serves on the Armed Services Committee to make sure that our Commonwealth's priorities and our country's priorities are addressed in this legislation. Within this NDAA Act, some of the work that I'm working on is making sure that we continue to recruit and retain our nation's finest men and women. I'm making sure that we're focusing on retention of women, on quality of military housing, on child care, on the very things that frankly, I separated the military from the military because of, to make sure we're able to bring our best and brightest to work every day on our behalves wearing our uniform. I'm making sure that we're focused locally as well on keeping good paying jobs at the Sikorsky Helicopter Factory in Coatesville. I'm making sure that we're focusing on cyber and bio vulnerabilities in my work on the Emerging Threats Subcommittee. And I'm making sure that we're focusing on PFAS, which is a very dangerous chemical that has pervaded our water supply. And we're making sure to think about how we can get rid of that chemical as rapidly as possible and the use cases for it so that our drinking water is safe. I'm also making sure that the CDC has the funds to do its congressionally mandated health studies and to make sure those research efforts are coordinated. And I'm lastly fighting back to make sure that we are protecting our labor, our DoD labor workforce, to make sure that they are being honored in the jobs that they serve on. I also, as you probably know, serve on the Small Business Subcommittee as well. And on the Small Business Subcommittee, I'm making sure to ensure that our small business owners and employers are able as best as possible to weather this storm. Lastly, we will talk a little bit about the district update. Within the district, I am myself fundamentally a small business owner and operator and entrepreneur. I take my responsibility as our representative very, very seriously. I cost the taxpayers, my office costs the taxpayers about $1.3 million annually. And so it's my responsibility to make sure I return on your investment in me and in my staff. I'm very excited to announce that we've almost returned $3 million within the year and a half that I've been serving as your representative, and we've closed over 1,000 cases so far. So even though we are working, as many of us are, remotely and teleworking, we're making sure that we're continuing to work on those things that are federally related. So if you continue to have issues, whether with the VA or Social Security Administration, the IRS, or with other federal agencies, please make sure you do reach out to our office, and I'll make sure that I give that information on how to do that at the end of this call as well. The last thing that I'll leave you with before we go into questions is that I want to make sure to emphasize the importance of the census. Every 10 years, we go through the period of our census where we're asked to document that we are in our communities and a little bit of information about ourselves. This census informs how billions of dollars are spent in our local community. And this funding goes to local priorities like schools and hospitals and infrastructure projects. So it really, really matters that we are counted, each and every one of us. The census helps local and state officials enforce important laws like the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act and protects vulnerable populations as well. You should be assured that your information is kept safe and very private, no matter how you respond. So the census is looking for your information to make sure that you filled out the 2020 census, and you can still be counted. You can respond in a number of ways and be counted. One is by going online. Again, here's where you might need a pen or pencil. You can go to the website my2020census.gov. Again, that's my2020census.gov. And I can tell you, because I did this firsthand, that this is very easy, and fill out a very easy, simple form to be counted. You can also just phone the Census Bureau. And the way to do that is in English for English speakers, 844-330-2020, or for Spanish speakers, 844-468-2020. It is very, very imperative for the resources to be delivered to our community that we deserve, that we all are counted. So I please encourage you to participate in the census. So now we're moving on to our questions and answer period. I'm going to turn it back over to Connor, who will explain again how we can register our questions and what the process will be. Over to you, Connor.
Thank you so much, Representative. So yes, just a reminder, we have a number of questions in the queue, which is fantastic. But if you still have a question you would like to ask, please press *3 at any point between now and the end of the call. Please press *3 so we can get you to one of our staff members to take down your question and get you in the queue. With that, I'd like to get us started. So our first question today comes from Nick in Westchester. Nick, you should be on the line, sir.
Actually, it's she.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So before I even go into my question, are there any representatives online on this call from unemployment?
No, ma'am, and hi. This is Christy. This is just the federal office. You're a representative from Washington, D.C., but we certainly would be able to connect you with people at the state level after this call.
Oh, well, then I'm just going to forego my question because it wouldn't pertain. No one would be able to answer it. So thank you for your time, and thanks for having the town hall.
Of course, and let me go ahead and talk a little bit about the task forces that we did talk about earlier, because they are important, and I believe we can be helpful to you and to many others who might be on this call as well. Please do reach out to our task forces so that we can be helpful if you have any questions. It is true, in fact, that disbursement of unemployment benefits is a state government responsibility. And as our federal representative, my job is to send the resources over to the states to be able to be responsive. And it is definitely evident that it's been hard. You know, of course, we're in a very unusual time to ramp up as rapidly as we have to serve as many people as we are. And unemployment in general has been expanded pretty significantly to include a lot of different categories of folks that it didn't include before. And it also includes an additional authorization of $600 a week through the month of July. So it's really important that you go ahead and reach out to our office, please, because we can be helpful in making sure to connect you with those very hard to get to resources within the state. And we have certainly been hearing from not just you, but from others, that there still is some frustration with the unemployment system. And so I will, at the end of the call, again, emphasize the names and emails of our office that you can reach out to so that we can be helpful.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And reminder, everyone, as well, the Congresswoman will give those emails out again at the end, but also on our website at houlihan.house.gov, you'll be able to find a full page of information as well as those contact emails. All right, our next question is from Chris in Westchester. Chris, you should be on the line.
Thank you. Representative Houlihan, thank you for taking my call. I had a question. Unfortunately, the governor's phase-in approach is less than clear on his website with regard to going from yellow to green, and I understand we're going to be going to green perhaps this Friday. I know that the website talks about that gatherings of up to 250 people are acceptable. Family gatherings would be, I would imagine, but it's less than clear as to what that would mean, whether we still would require PPE protection, social distancing with that. And I don't know if you have any further guidance on that or any insight into that.
Sure, and thank you, Chris. Do you go by Christopher or Chris? Thank you very much for your question. I will tell you what I know about our transition to the green phase, and that will happen on Friday for Chester and Berks County, which is the 6th congressional district, is all of Chester County and the lower part of Berks County. You're right to say that there are certain guidelines and guidances, and one of them is prohibiting gatherings of 250 or more people. Another is to require that masks are worn when you're entering a business. It requires restaurants and bars to be, if they're going to be open, to be only open at 50% occupancy, but they are allowed to be open inside as well as outside. It does allow us to open the personal care service industry, so things like salons and barbershops will be able to be opened as of Friday, but it also, similar to the restaurant business, asks for 50% occupancy within those organizations and businesses, and also asks that be by appointment only to try and control crowds and flow of traffic. Indoor recreation, health and wellness centers, personal care services like gyms and spas also are allowed to be open in the green phase, again on Friday, but again with 50% occupancy and a very strong emphasis on appointments. Entertainment is going to be able to be open, so this is casinos or theaters or shopping malls, again at the 50% occupancy. And construction can be open at full bore, largely because much of that tends to be outside. I'm definitely not going to be prescriptive in terms of what you should and shouldn't do. Your question, I think, about PPE and that sort of thing. But I definitely would remind you that COVID transmission is very sneaky, and it's very much present in people who don't express any symptoms at all. So I guess what my advice would be, if you are going to gather in whatever quantity or group of people that you're gathering, or however close you're gathering, that you still learn from our very hard-won and hard-earned lessons that we should wear PPE, meaning a mask, that we should socially distance when we're able, and that we know that this has been a lot of work to get where we are, and we're seeing consequences if we, let our guard down across the nation, and we can't afford to have to go back to where we are right now. So I know that some of the guidances are a little less than, completely crystal clear, and I think in some cases that's left up to interpretation in many ways deliberately. But I think that we all kind of know how hard it's been to get where we are right now, and we just need to make sure we keep it so that we don't end up having to go backwards. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Christopher, for your question. Our next question comes from Ms. Josephine in Reading. Josephine, you should be on the line.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Josephine.
Yes, I don't know if it's me that I'm supposed to be talking or not, but my question was, the way I understand from someone said that if you owe back taxes or child support or any other government due, probation or whatever, that you will not get the stimulus check. Am I correct?
Thanks, Josephine, for your question. And we have definitely gotten a bunch of questions over eligibility for these checks, and there are still people who are looking for their checks and trying to understand whether or not they're eligible. According to the IRS guidelines, they will not be garnishing stimulus checks, meaning they should not be holding stimulus checks because you have unpaid federal or state debts. The exception is unpaid child support, which is a court order for payment. So we do have, as Connor we do have, in terms of people dialing into this call and also into our office, a lot of folks who are asking these kinds of questions about whether they're eligible or not. There is a website that I would recommend you go to if you've got a pen or pencil. The website is www.irs, as in Internal Revenue Service, .gov, and then there's /coronavirus, and then / and this is a little bit long, but follow me on it, get my payment frequently asked questions. And all of that is as if it were a sentence, but with hyphens in between all of the lines. And so again, it's www.irs.gov/coronavirus /get my payment frequently asked questions. Please also remember that you can contact our team and we can help you with that if for whatever reason you're not don't have a pencil or pen available, and I'll make sure that I give you again the information about how to do that. But if you haven't gotten your check, please also know that there are still that have not gone out the door. And some people also have been getting their payment literally on debit cards. So please also be on the lookout for different ways of receiving your payment. Some people get them directly to their bank account. Some people get them in the form of checks, and some people get them in the form of debit cards. And if you have any questions at all, please let our team know, and we'll be happy to help with that. Thank you, Josephine, for your question.
Thank you, Josephine. And our next question comes from Fred in West Lawn. So, Fred, you should be on the line now.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Representative, for meeting with us in the past. And I would like to ask where you stand in providing any financial help for the USPS. From the start of this pandemic, postal employees have continued to serve the American public and every neighborhood in the United States. Other delivery companies have received help in the earliest stimulus package, but the USPS has found themselves in financial trouble because of the shutdown of the economy. Is there any plan to help the USPS and their over 600,000 employees and every American that relies and benefits from our service?
Hi, Fred, and I really appreciate your question, and I am a huge supporter of the U.S. Postal Service for many reasons, not the least of which that right now during a pandemic, this is one of the only lifelines that people have to medications or to family, and it is an essential service. And so I'm grateful to you and to your organization and your colleagues for your essential service. I also believe that this is an essential service, as we've seen during pandemic, for something as fundamental as our right to vote. Chester County and Berks County really exercised their right to vote during our most recent primary because they were able to access ballots that they could mail in, and that allowed poll workers to be safe, it allowed voters to be safe, and it is fundamentally our right, and the U.S. Postal Service is fundamental to that. So I hope that you're hearing that I'm very much a supporter of the essential service that's the post office. One of the things that I can do in Congress is not only legislate, but also advocate, and I recently signed a letter that was bipartisan advocating for more funding in the next COVID package for the U.S. Postal Service, specifically for $25 million in emergency funding for the U.S. Postal Service. Also in the package that was most recently passed, the HEROES Act, there was also post office funding included as well. So I share your concern and anxiety, Fred, and I'm working on it.
Thank you, Fred, for your question. Our next question comes from Joan in Coatesville. Joan, you should be on the line now.
Thank you for taking my call and for providing this forum. Although you state that, we did very well in the primary, I've heard a lot of frustration coming from people who went to the polls. What is being done to prepare people to advertise, first of all, the safety and lack of corruption? Historically, I believe it's like 0.0% of mail-in ballots to counterattack the information that we get out of the White House, and to better staff the polls, provide standby service people for any sort of technical problems, and also for counting votes in the November election.
Hi, Joan. Thanks for the question. And, this is, of course, related to the question about the post office and making sure that we are able to provide ballots where people have requested them, process them where they've mailed them in a timely and expedient way so that we can get good results that people can trust and can count on. I think that this is a very important question, and a lot of what happens at the federal level in this area is providing resources, which means dollars that go down to the states and to local government so that they can be able to address this issue. Many of our state and local governments are frankly kind of tapped out right now because they've been spending resources to fight this pandemic on PPE or on first responders or on the right places to make sure that we're addressing this crisis. And so a lot of their rainy day funds have been kind of tapped out as a consequence. And so part of our responsibility as a Congress is to backfill those rainy day funds so that they are made whole, and so that those state and local municipalities who make those decisions about how to process, the voting public are able to afford to do that, are able to, get polling workers, to get, to be able to process quickly. And you saw an unexpected demand because of the pandemic. And you saw that we had to react to that. And what that means in terms of reaction is we have to have the resources to be able to do that. So in addition to trying to make whole the state and local governments who spent a lot of money on this pandemic so that they can have resources back to think about this, the federal government is also trying to push resources to the state and local governments to make their election system safer, to make their poll workers safer. And so as an example, the HEROES Act, which was passed in the House a few weeks ago now, included $3.6 billion with a B for state and local governments to make their election system safer for voters and safer for poll workers under these conditions. The HEROES Act also included the American Coronavirus or COVID-19 Election Safety and Security Act, which is, of course, everything in Congress has an acronym. So that's the Access Act. And so that requires that places have contingency plans for elections. It requires 15 days of early voting and no excuse absentee vote ballot nationwide. So these are some of the things that the federal government in the form of the House is trying to ask our state and local governments to do so that we protect that most sacred thing, which is the ballot, and the vote. Unfortunately, the HEROES bill passed the House a few weeks ago, but it has not been considered by the Senate at all. So I would encourage you, if these are things that matter to you, and I think they should matter to all of us, that you ping your senator, Senator Toomey and Senator Casey in this case, to ask them to take up the HEROES Act and to pass it through the Senate as well, because there really is a lot of good in that particular bill that protects our right to vote. Thanks, Joan, for your question. Let's see if Connor has any more.
I do. Thank you so much, Joan. Our next question comes from Braden in West Grove. So, Braden, you should be on the line.
Hi. So my question is if you could speak a little more to the police brutality that you're, like the legislature that you're enacting, and specifically, will you say Black Lives Matter? Because a lot of politicians have refrained from using that specific phrase.
Sure, of course, and absolutely Black Lives Matter. And this bill that I will be voting on, Injustice in Policing Act of 2020, addresses that. This is a pretty darn good, pretty darn comprehensive bill that has been very thoughtfully put together on the House side. I think it's a fairly pragmatic bill, which isn't as provocative as it possibly could be. And so I will be in support of this bill. I am a co-sponsor of this legislation. It stops, as I mentioned in our introduction, no-knock warrants, particularly related to drug cases. It also, as I mentioned, ends qualified immunity, which is a barrier to holding our police officers accountable for wrongful conduct. And I do want to make sure I caveat this conversation by saying that the vast majority of policemen are there to protect and serve. But this qualified immunity doctrine is to talk to that very, very small percent that is not behaving as their pledge and oath requires them to. This bill also combats racial profiling, and it also importantly has a lot of data collection aspects to it. And those are very, very important, whether they're body cameras or dashboard cameras. And it, as I mentioned in kind of the introduction, it makes sure to take those standards for policing, the training that might be required, databases that might be required, and tie them to the federal funding that is provided from the national government to the state and local government. This bill will probably be voted on tomorrow, although it's still not completely clear that we will have that vote yet. I have been here today watching the process on the House side. And there was to be also a similar vote on a relatively similar bill with a little less teeth in it on the Senate side as well. And the hope would be that those things would be conferenced together and combined together to some sort of piece of legislation that was would advance these very, very critical issues. It sounds as though today, at some point in time, the conversations on the Senate side fell apart and sort of started going sideways. So it doesn't look right now that the bill on the Senate side is viable. I'm not sure, but I would give it good odds that the bill on the House side is viable. The issue, of course, is that this is a government that has a House and a Senate, that there are 500 and something of us here in Washington that all have to come to some sort of compromise and agreement so that we can push this forward to our president for signature. And so that will be the challenge, is what parts of this legislation live to go to the Senate and then to go to the president's desk. I hope I answered your question. Thank you so much. I think we have another question, Connor. Do you have another question?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Braden. Our next question comes from Kevin in Coatesville. Kevin, you should be on the line.
Yes, thank you, Representative Houlihan. Specifically, why does not the House bill on the crime side specifically ban all no-knock warrants instead of just in relation to drug issues only? I believe that all no-knock warrants are very troublesome and dangerous for all involved, and that practice should be stopped. Thank you.
Hi, Kevin, and thank you for your concern and for your question. We definitely can and should have a conversation about police tactics, including no-knock warrants. I've spent actually quite a bit of the last couple of weeks in conversations with our law enforcement and with our advocates and activists in this area. This is a difficult conversation. The choice to include a prohibition on no-knock warrants was in response, as you probably know, to the death of Breonna Taylor. And so we are in the process of talking to enforcement experts as well as advocates and activists about how to strike a good balance between keeping our communities safe, but also making sure that our police officers have the ability to keep themselves safe in the event of a really violent and truly violent situation. So it's a complicated balance. Karen Bass, who's the author of this bill, is the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she worked very, very hard with all of these different groups and interest groups to try to put forward the most sensible first step in this conversation and to make sure that we have as many people brought along as possible in this. And I think the first step is the conversation about no-knock warrants in the case of drugs. But it's definitely a subject that we can continue the conversation on.
Thank you for your question, Kevin. Our next question comes from Andrea in Kennett Square. Andrea, you should be on the line.
Hello.
Hi, Andrea.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you so much for all the work you and your staff are doing. Thank you. My specific question is about the FEED Act, and I was wondering, I guess it was introduced a while back, if you had any information on the progress of that.
I'm sorry, you dropped out when you said what the name of the act was. Can you tell me what the name of the act is again?
Yes, the FEED, the FEED Act. It would allow the federal government to pay 100% of the cost to state and localities so they can partner with restaurants to prepare food during times like when COVID is ramping. But it would be at a federal level.
Okay. Well, I very much appreciate your question, and I know that this is a piece of legislation that Chef Jose Andres and Senator Kamala Harris and Tim Scott actually put forward on the Senate side, and Jim McGovern and Mike Thompson on the House side. I will take a look at this legislation and see what I can do to see if I'm able to kind of get behind it. I am incredibly dedicated and devoted to issues of food and food scarcity. And you're right, it's particularly acute right now when we're in a time of pandemic. One of the things that I learned as a freshman in Congress is that every 2 years, there are 7,000 bills that go through our House of Representatives with each session. And it's really, really hard for any member and their staff to be able to sort of track them all and figure out whether or not to be supportive of them or not. This subject matters. It is something that I resonate with and that I'd like to take a look at, but I am not currently a co-sponsor of the bill, but I will definitely take a look at it, and I very much appreciate you bringing it to my attention. Another thing that I would say is, for your edification, because it was something that I learned, every 2 years, not only do 7,000 bills come up in front of the House, but only about 400 or 500 of them get a vote of any form, and only about 100 or so of them, or at least in this time, will go forward for the president's signature. So one of the things that's really important for you all to do to help me is to call my attention to bills such as this that are important to you so that we can take a look at them. Another thing that I'll say is that many bills have similar purposes and are supported by different groups. And so one of the calculations that we do in our team is to figure out if this is an issue that we believe our community is passionate about, which one of these efforts has the most opportunity to cross the finish line, here in the House, and the most opportunity to be addressed in the Senate. And so as an example, this one has both House and Senate representation, so that's good. And it also has bipartisan representation, and so that's good. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for when things are elevated to us from our community. Thanks for your question.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Our next question comes from Paul in Downingtown. Paul, you should be on the line, sir.
Yes. I've been hearing that there is going to be a second personal stimulus check being sent out. Do you have any idea when this could happen or if it's going to happen?
Hi, Paul, and I also have heard that, but I'm sitting in Washington as our representative, and I haven't heard anything more than what you probably have heard. So those things tend to end up sort of sounding like things that may eventually come true. So I'm hopeful too. I'm hopeful that there may be another stimulus package or stimulus set of legislation. As I mentioned with HEROES actually had an extension to unemployment. It had a lot of extensions to the Paycheck Protection Act, but then arguably it has not gone anywhere. So our challenge is in the remaining 4 or 5 weeks of session to find what we all can collectively agree on. And this seems to be something that the Senate is agreeable to. It also seems to be something that the president has indicated that he's agreeable to as well. And so with that seems like a good recipe for something to move forward. I'm hopeful that if that in fact is something that moves forward, that it is combined with other help and other ways to address problems. As an example, the HEROES Act had a pretty good and significant portion of the resources going to, as I mentioned, kind of backfill the expenditures of our state and local governments. They are beginning, unfortunately, to end up having to lay off many of the people who we rely on as essential, first responders as an example, because the local governments and municipalities don't have the resources and tax revenues any longer that they did pre-pandemic. And so, yes, we should think about making sure we're taking care of individuals with things like thinking about another stimulus or thinking about what we'll do to extend unemployment. But we should also be thinking about how to protect our municipalities and our governments as well. So I think there's possibly still enough time to think about another stimulus program of one form or another. I'm hopeful that we can find the collective will to do that in the House and the Senate. But I will be really honest with you, we're running out of daylight on this because every day that goes by is a day closer to our election, is a day closer to people being less willing to, do the right thing. And so I will continue to work to try and get something across the finish line while I'm here.
Thank you so much for your question, Paul. Our next question comes from Karen, and Karen is calling from Kennett Square. Karen, you should be on the line.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate all your work. I have a connected question. I've heard today that Trump is planning on ending the federal funding for community testing sites. I wanted to know if you knew about this, and if it is the case, how this will affect the availability of testing in Pennsylvania, and tied in with the HERO Act that Mnuchin has refused to divulge where the billions of dollars went. And I want to know what Congress can do to keep the federal funds for testing and to get a transparency in how this money is being spent. Thank you.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for your questions, and there's a lot to unpack there. I am also disheartened when I hear the president say that he wants to scale back testing, and I did see that today. This is sort of federal testing sites that he is closing up shop on, and in fact, a few weeks ago, you might recall that he did something similar or threatened something similar in the Montgomery County area. I think this is unfortunate. I think that I'm an engineer myself, and I believe in making good decisions based on data. I think knowing where the virus is really important, and particularly I believe a federal response and a federal understanding of where this virus is very important, so that we can make good decisions as a nation about how to make sure that we keep ourselves and our community safe. And that's why as I started in the beginning of the conversation, talked about a national testing strategy, talked about the importance of a national testing force. Because even though, I serve Chester and Lower Berks counties, and we know, that we're from Pennsylvania, clearly we're not a nation or an economy that is drawn by, lines in the sand, and we are transitory people. We move around quite a bit. So I think we need definitely to know how this virus is spreading. We need to also, as we talked about, know that asymptomatic people are certainly spreading this disease. Many people have had it and didn't know about it, and they've potentially infected, their friends and their families and their coworkers. So testing can definitely get us answers. So the long and the short of that is I will continue to make sure that we're fighting to get resources to our states to be able to do this testing, to our municipalities and local governments to be able to do the testing. I think in the case of Chester and Berks counties, we have stood up some pretty decent testing facilities and mechanisms that they, are not a complete solution, but are a good solution. So I'm grateful that we've been able to do that. You also did talk a little bit, though, as well about, Karen, about the transparency of, reporting where resources are being spent. And I think that's very, very important. I serve, as I mentioned, on the Small Business Committee, and some of the hearings that we've been having recently are asking Secretary Mnuchin to be forthcoming with where resources are going, how they're being spent, who's getting them. We need that information. We need that information because you are owed it. You're a tax-paying citizen and you need to know where things are going. But we also need the information to make sure we know whether things are working. We need to understand whether the resources that we're sending in very unusual times are an effective use of dollars so that we can redeploy them if they're not. And also if we're in a situation with secondary spikes or rounds of this disease or unfortunately some other similar kind of spike or crisis, that we know what worked and we know what didn't. And the only way that we can know that is by requiring and demanding transparency of data. You may have seen, Karen, today, I think, or yesterday, Secretary Mnuchin did say that he would be more forthcoming with some data. It is a good start, partial start, and we will continue to press on him for full transparency on that. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Karen, for your question. And we have time for one more question this evening. There are still more people in the queue. Over the course of the town hall, we've had nearly 2,600 people join. So thank you all so much. But if we did not get to your question tonight, we have taken it down if you've spoken to one of our staff members, and we will give you a call back within 48 hours. So our last question tonight comes from Lance at Lincoln University. Lance, you should be on the line now. Oh, wait. Now you should be on the line, sir.
Thank you very much. My questions and concerns revolve around schools starting back up in the fall. I know that a lot of fall sports and band activities and things are going to be starting within the next month or so. And there are a lot of children with the childhood obesity problems that are high risk. There are a lot of teachers that are in the high risk category. I'm not sure what kind of guidance has been given to a lot of these schools, but a lot of schools don't have air conditioning for the classrooms, and there are concerns with fans blowing virus around and air conditioners not filtering out virus particles. I was just wondering but facing all of those problems, what can your office do to help that situation in our schools?
Hi, Lance. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know if you know this about me, but I was a teacher of high school chemistry. I taught at Gratz High School in North Philly, and we had air conditioning, but didn't barely worked. So I do understand the anxieties of teaching, going back to school in hot and enclosed classrooms, and the concerns about the safety of teachers and children and their families. And as you probably also know, that as a federal representative, I don't get to make any of the calls really on what gets open and how it gets open, but I can make some calls. I can be helpful on the legislative side of things to make sure that we open as safely as possible. So an example of something that I am trying to push forward and I am a co-sponsor of is a legislative act that's called Protect Our Children from COVID-19. It's an act, and it requires HHS to coordinate with other agencies to understand and study the transmissibility of COVID amongst children. And as you know, we really don't understand this disease full stop, but we clearly don't understand it with its relationship to children and its transmissibility to children and adults. So this would be to try and understand that better and those risks better so that we can make better plans and understand the disease. The bill also requires the Secretary of HHS to send out or disseminate to stakeholders best practices for protecting children and adults in the educational settings that we're talking about. If a lot of what I've learned in my freshman year in Congress is that my role in oversight, my role in appropriation, and my role in legislation, one of the things that's most useful is the role of dissemination and oversight. And so if this bill were to be successful, I think it would be important and impactful for the Secretary to be required to share best practices for protecting our children and adults. It's not mandating anything on the states and municipalities and local governments, but it's using our best practices and our best information, which is, I think, the promise of our federal government's responsibility. So I would encourage you, Lance, to check out as well the state website. I feel like it's pa.state.edu, but I will take a look and have one of my team members call you back. That gives you kind of an update on what the state is thinking about that as well. I very much appreciate that question, Lance, and I think we are maybe finishing up, Connor, with a little bit of closing remarks.
Yes, ma'am. So again, everyone, thank you so much for your questions. There are still some more in the queue, and we will make sure to get back to those with a call in the next 48 hours. A member of Christie's staff will reach out to you. So with that, Congresswoman, it's all yours.
Thanks, Connor, and thank you guys for joining us tonight. We're going to try and end just on time. Even though we are moving to green, there are a couple things that I want to remind our community of. I'm enormously proud of the work that we've done collectively during this very, very difficult time on these dual pandemics, the pandemic of COVID as well as the pandemic of really recognizing and coming to a recognition of the importance of racial equity and social justice. But what I would remind us as we come into the green phase is let's not forget all the lessons that we learned the hard way. Let's make sure that we're continuing to practice hygiene, which of course means washing our hands for 20 seconds or longer, blowing our nose into tissues, coughing or sneezing into our elbows and not our hands, making sure that we are not touching our eyes, nose, or mouth with unwashed hands. And I know we're all sort of losing the focus because we've been sheltering in place for so long or been kind of distanced for so long, but we need to not forget that. We need to continue to practice social distancing, keeping 6 feet between ourselves whenever possible. We need to make sure that we're wearing masks. According to our governor, Pennsylvanians are required to wear masks when we're entering any business in all counties in both yellow and green phases of reopening. And the last thing that I will say is, hey, this is hard on all of us. And if you are struggling with any sort of mental issue because of the pressures that are put upon all of us right now, please say something to somebody. And if you see somebody who's struggling, please help them and reach out to them. We have some resources on our website that we'll be sure to share with you later. If you go to houlihan.house.gov, you will find a full page on resources. So it's very, very busy time in Congress, and for all of us, I'm really, really grateful for the chance to be able to share kind of an update of what's been going on in our community. I look forward to continuing the conversation, probably most likely for the foreseeable future in ways such as this, because of our status in green. But thank you so much for the privilege that you've given me for serving us in Congress. I look forward to coming back home and telling you more. Thanks very much.